Welcome to the world of the ancient library of Alexandria, a place where stories whisper from every papyrus. Tonight, we embark on a journey with a young Greek scholar drawn to this beacon of learning. So, settle in, find your coziest nook, perhaps wrap yourself in a blanket. Let your eyelids grow heavy, letting the weight of the day drift away. It's time to relax, really relax, with a gentle breath. Now, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it where you are? Evening or morning in your perfectly chaotic schedule? It's always a little wonder to imagine where these tales might find you. If you're finding comfort in these narratives, consider subscribing so you don't miss a single one. It's a simple way to bring a little more calm to your week. And now, let us step back in time. Imagine yourself standing before towering shelves, the scent of aged papyrus, a comforting, familiar perfume. Our young scholar, fresh from the intellectual heartlands of Greece, has just arrived, his heart pounding with a single, burning ambition. The salt spray felt like a kiss from a distant promise, a cool caress against the persistent warmth of the sea. My journey from Greece had been long, filled with the rhythmic creak of timbers and the ceaseless whisper of waves against our hull, each mile bringing me closer to a place whispered about in the learned circles of Athens as the very heart of knowledge, Alexandria. The name itself conjured images of soaring marble and endless scrolls, a beacon for anyone who found more comfort in the turning of a page than in the clang of a sword. My own ambition had been ignited years ago, fueled by the meticulous work of textual criticism I had practiced with dedication, learning to tease out the true meaning from weathered texts, to understand the subtle shifts in language that revealed historical truths. My patron, a man of considerable influence and even more considerable resources, had supported my dream, providing the passage and coin, but his backing came with an unspoken weight. Failure, he had made clear through a simple, unwavering gaze, was not an option that would reflect well on either of us. As our ship finally rounded the harbor, the city unfolded before me not as a single entity, but as a vibrant tapestry woven from countless threads of life. The sheer scale of it took my breath away, a sprawling metropolis teeming with activity that spilled from its harbor onto the land. I watched as ships of every description docked, disgorging goods and people from lands I had only read about, their sails catching the breeze like eager wings. The air carried a symphony of unfamiliar sounds, the shouts of dock workers, the bleating of animals being herded, the distant clamor of a marketplace already in full swing. Yet, beneath this lively hum, I sensed an underlying current of something more profound, a gravity that drew scholars from across the known world. The sheer density of buildings, many adorned with the finest marble that gleamed under the open sky, spoke of a civilization that valued more than just trade and conquest. It valued understanding. My first days were a dizzying introduction to the Mosaeon, the scholarly complex attached to the great library itself. It was a world apart from the boisterous docks, a sanctuary of quiet contemplation. Walking through its grand colonnades, I felt a profound sense of entering a sacred space, where the pursuit of knowledge was the highest calling. Scholars, draped in simple but finely woven robes, moved with a quiet purpose, their faces often lost in the pages of papyrus scrolls they cradled with reverence. The gentle rustle of these scrolls being unrolled and re-rolled was a constant, soothing melody, a stark contrast to the harsh mix of sounds outside. I noticed the diversity of peoples gathered here, men from Egypt with their distinctive linen headdresses, others with darker skin from the south, all united by the common language of scholarship, Greek, which formed the intellectual lingua franca of this extraordinary place. The process of becoming a curator, I soon discovered, was not a matter of simple entry, but a rigorous gauntlet designed to test the very mettle of aspiring scholars. My initial assignment arrived like a weighty decree: to catalog a small collection of newly acquired Egyptian administrative documents. These were not the eloquent philosophical treatises I had practiced with, but the practical records of daily life, written in a script known as Demotic. I had studied its theoretical principles, the way its cursive forms flowed with an almost liquid grace, but now I had to apply that knowledge to tangible evidence, to decipher the practical matters of taxation, land ownership, and civic order. The weight of this task settled upon my shoulders, for my patron's initial goodwill and my continued access to the library's vast resources depended on my ability to prove my worth, to show I could navigate even the most utilitarian of texts. As I painstakingly worked through the delicate papyrus sheets, the ink faded in places, and the script itself often looped and joined in ways that made individual characters elusive, I stumbled upon a particularly interesting find. It was a decree, partially preserved, that bore inscriptions in not one, not two, but 3 distinct scripts. One was the familiar Greek, another was a more formal hieroglyphic Egyptian, and the third was the Demotic script I was wrestling with. A tremor of excitement ran through me, a feeling I recognized from moments of intellectual breakthrough back home. This could be more than just administrative record-keeping. It could be a key, a bridge between languages. Remembering my foundational training in comparative philology, the study of languages and their historical development, I felt an immediate pull to unravel its secrets, a task that promised to be both deeply challenging and profoundly rewarding. The process of deciphering that decree became an obsession, a silent battle fought with painstaking comparisons and careful observation. I spent long hours tracing the shapes of the symbols, noting their recurring patterns and their placement relative to the Greek text, which I could understand with relative ease. It felt like piecing together a shattered mosaic, where each tiny fragment of understanding offered a glimpse of the larger picture. There were moments of intense frustration, when missing portions of the papyrus rendered entire phrases unintelligible, and I could only guess at their meaning based on the surrounding context. Yet with each successful identification, each repeated phrase that unlocked a new segment of meaning, a surge of exhilarating discovery propelled me forward. I felt the intellectual gears of the library turning within me, connecting me to a lineage of scholars who had faced similar puzzles and, through diligent effort, found their solutions. This early success, however, did not go unnoticed by everyone. My dedicated work on the Demotic documents and the subsequent deciphering of the trilingual decree had drawn the attention of one of the library's senior curators, a man whose reputation for deep scholarship was matched only by his fierce territoriality over certain fields of study, particularly those related to Egyptian antiquities. His name was Lycon, and I learned through hushed conversations among other junior scholars that he guarded his knowledge with a possessiveness that bordered on the avaricious. He approached me one afternoon, his expression polite but his eyes sharp, offering thinly veiled critiques of my methods. He questioned the assumptions I had made in deciphering certain passages, suggesting I had overstepped my bounds by delving into an area he considered his own. It was a subtle but clear warning, a signal that my path within the library would be as much about navigating the intricate personalities of its staff as it was about the pursuit of pure knowledge. The true immensity of the library's holdings began to reveal itself when I was finally granted limited access to a section of the Great Hall of Scrolls. It was a moment I had anticipated with a hunger that gnawed at me. Standing at the threshold, the sheer scale of the room was overwhelming. Countless papyrus scrolls, each rolled and tied with care, were arranged on shelves that seemed to reach endlessly into the cool, shaded heights. The marble floors felt smooth and cool beneath my sandals, a welcome sensation after the warmer air of the outer halls. A faint, dry aroma, the distinct scent of aged papyrus, and perhaps a touch of preservative oils permeated the space, a fragrance that spoke of centuries of accumulated thought. Overheard fragments of conversation from other scholars, discussions about newly arrived texts from the Eastern Desert caravans, debates about the authenticity of a rediscovered poetic fragment, only deepened my sense of awe at the sheer breadth of human endeavor contained within these walls. My next substantial task moved me further into the realm of historical reconstruction. I was presented with a collection of fragmented scrolls, seemingly disconnected pieces of what was once a grand historical chronicle. The challenge was immense: to identify overlapping passages, to understand differing accounts of the same events, and to meticulously reassemble narratives from these disparate sources. This work demanded a deep understanding of textual criticism, the art of evaluating texts for their authenticity and accuracy, of discerning which passages might be later additions or accidental errors that had crept in over time. The personal stake was considerable. If I could successfully reconstruct even a portion of this lost chronicle, it would mean recovering a significant piece of history, a previously unknown voice from the past, and solidifying my reputation as a scholar capable of bringing the dead to life through their words. Lycan, the senior scholar, made his presence felt again as I delved into the fragmented chronicle. During a small gathering where junior scholars presented their work, he subtly raised doubts about my findings. He specifically targeted a section where I had identified what I believed to be a crucial link between two otherwise separate accounts, suggesting that the fragment I presented as evidence was perhaps a forgery or a misinterpretation. His questioning was couched in academic politeness, yet the implication was clear. He sought to undermine my conclusions, and by extension, my credibility. It was a heated, albeit controlled, professional exchange where I had to defend my methodology, explaining the criteria I used for authentication and provenance tracing, the history of ownership and origin of the texts. I realized then that my ambition was not simply to uncover knowledge, but also to survive and thrive amidst the intellectual rivalries and politics that permeated even the most esteemed halls of learning. Seeking clarification on a particularly obscure reference within one of the chronicle fragments, a reference to a forgotten Alexandrian ritual, I was directed to a different kind of archivist. He was an older librarian, a man whose movements were slow and deliberate, who managed a section of the archives that was less frequented, more shadowed. He greeted me not with the bustling energy of the main halls, but with a quiet, knowing smile. While he provided the specific information I sought, detailing the ritual with surprising clarity, he also offered something more profound. He spoke in hushed tones about the library's role not just as a repository of knowledge, but as a guardian of potentially sensitive information, texts that governments or powerful individuals might wish to remain hidden. He emphasized the importance of discretion, planting a seed of doubt about the library's commitment to the open dissemination of all knowledge, suggesting that some truths were carefully curated, or perhaps deliberately obscured. My duties eventually led me to the scriptorium, the beating heart of the library's preservation efforts. Here, I witnessed firsthand the painstaking labor involved in ensuring that the precious papyrus scrolls would endure for generations to come. Scribes, their brows furrowed in concentration, meticulously copied texts onto fresh papyrus, their reed pens scratching rhythmically against the surface. I learned about the different types of inks used, made from soot or ochre, and the various methods of treating papyrus to make it more durable. The careful cataloging methods employed, each scroll assigned a unique identifier and stored according to complex organizational systems, revealed the immense logistical undertaking required to manage such a vast collection. It was here, amidst the quiet industry of copying and restoration, that I also learned about the shadowy world of forgeries that plagued the trade of ancient texts, a reminder that not all that was presented as ancient held true historical value. While examining a fresh consignment of scrolls that had arrived from a recently subdued territory, a disquieting pattern began to emerge. I discovered annotations, marginalia, and cross-references within these documents that suggested deliberate historical alteration. It appeared that certain accounts, particularly those detailing the territory's resistance to the ruling empire, had been either systematically removed or rewritten to present a more favorable narrative for the victors. This discovery ignited a deep internal conflict within me. My core belief, the very reason I had dedicated my life to scholarship, was the preservation and dissemination of truthful knowledge. Yet here I was, confronted with evidence of deliberate suppression, of history being shaped for political expediency. I wrestled with the implications, the profound clash between my personal ethics and the potential realities of how power influenced the very records I held sacred. This internal struggle soon presented me with a direct and deeply personal choice. The scrolls containing the evidence of historical suppression were now in my hands. I could follow established protocol, re-archive them without comment, effectively burying the truth beneath layers of official cataloging. Or I could attempt to discreetly preserve the original, unaltered fragments, marking them in a way that might allow for their future discovery. The stakes were terrifyingly clear. Revealing the truth, even through subtle means, could jeopardize my position, potentially alienate my patron, and even place my safety at risk within the complex power dynamics of the library. Remaining silent, however, felt like a betrayal of everything I believed in, a tacit endorsement of the very distortion I had uncovered. After much deliberation, I chose to subtly secure the original fragments, marking them with a coded symbol only I would understand, a silent promise to a future that might be more receptive. To further solidify my standing and demonstrate my capacity for meticulous scholarship, I was assigned the task of authenticating a collection of ancient philosophical treatises. This was a formidable undertaking, requiring rigorous comparative analysis, tracing the provenance or the history of ownership and origin of each manuscript with an almost forensic precision. I needed to identify any inconsistencies, any stylistic anachronisms, or any evidence of later editions that might suggest forgery or misattribution. My expertise in identifying pseudepigrapha, writings falsely attributed to a respected author to lend them authority, was put to its greatest test. The intellectual challenge was immense, and the thought of making a critical error, of misjudging the authenticity of a seminal work, sent a shiver of apprehension down my spine, a stark reminder of the weight of responsibility that came with such prestigious assignments. During this intensive authentication process, I found an unexpected ally in another ambitious young scholar, a man named Theron, whose specialization lay in the ancient languages of the East. Our paths crossed as we both grappled with particularly challenging passages, and we soon found ourselves sharing information and insights, our mutual respect growing with each shared discovery. He possessed a keen eye for linguistic nuances that differed from my own, and I, in turn, could offer a different perspective on the historical context of the texts we examined. This collaboration provided not only practical assistance, but also a much-needed sense of camaraderie, a shared understanding of the academic challenges and the subtle political currents that ran beneath the surface of scholarly life. Together, we voiced our growing concerns about the hidden agendas we suspected were at play within the institution. As I spent more time in Alexandria, the city itself began to transform from a mere backdrop for my studies into a vibrant, living entity deeply intertwined with the knowledge I was uncovering. I ventured into the bustling markets, where merchants hawked rare spices and exotic goods that I had only encountered as dry descriptions in the scrolls. The aroma of roasting meats mingled with the sweet scent of ripening figs, and the calls of vendors offering their wares painted a vivid picture of the world that had produced these texts. Nearby, the constant low murmur of the harbor, punctuated by the cries of gulls and the distant shouts of sailors, served as a constant reminder of the vast network of trade and communication that brought these precious documents to the library from across the known world. This immersion in the city's tangible realities deepened my understanding of the context from which the library's knowledge sprang, grounding the abstract pursuit of scholarship in the concrete experience of life. Having navigated the intricate political currents, demonstrated my growing expertise, and made difficult choices regarding the integrity of historical records, I was finally offered a permanent position as a curator within the Great Library. It was a moment of profound reflection. I thought back to my arrival, a hopeful but somewhat naive scholar from Greece, and compared that self to the more seasoned individual I had become. I had learned not only about the vast expanse of human knowledge, but also about the complex responsibilities that came with safeguarding it, about the subtle ways truth could be distorted, and the courage required to uphold its principles. I accepted the position not merely for the prestige it carried, but with a renewed commitment to the library's true purpose, the preservation and, ultimately, the eventual dissemination of knowledge, even when that knowledge proved inconvenient or even dangerous to those in power. My personal ambition had matured into a dedication to a cause far greater than myself. The weight of past decisions had tested me in ways I was only beginning to grasp. The ship's hull finally rested against the docks, and disembarking felt like stepping from one world into another. Alexandria. Even from the quay, the sheer scale of it impressed me, a testament to the Ptolemy's ambition. I clutched the worn satchel containing my patron's letter of introduction, the parchment already soft from my anxious grip. He had spoken of the Mausean, the Temple of the Muses, as the heart of this intellectual city, a place where the greatest minds gathered. My own ambition, long nurtured in the quiet cloisters of my Greek homeland, now felt a tangible, pressing force. My skill with ancient languages, my training in careful textual comparison, these were my tools, and my hope was to prove their worth within these hollowed walls. My patron's investment in my journey was considerable, and the unspoken expectation of success hung heavy, a constant reminder of the personal consequences of failure.
A courteous scholar, his robe a simple white linen that marked him as an insider,
guided me through the city's bustling thoroughfares and into the tranquil embrace of the Mausion. The transition was startling. The clamor of the port city faded, replaced by a pervasive, gentle quietude, broken only by the soft murmur of voices and the faint whisper of papyrus. I noticed scholars of every description, some with deeply furrowed brows bent over scrolls, others engaged in quiet, animated discussion, their robes and accents hinting at origins far beyond Greece. The space itself was grand, with high, arched ceilings and cool, polished floors that felt smooth beneath my sandals. This was not merely a building, but a sanctuary dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. My guide then led me to a smaller, yet no less impressive, annex. This, he explained, his voice hushed with respect, is where the true work of the library begins. Welcome to the preliminary stages. He gestured towards a small collection of scrolls laid out on a sturdy wooden table. These are recent acquisitions from Egypt. Your first task, should you accept, is to attempt their cataloging. Familiarity with Demotic script will be essential. Demotic, the everyday cursive script of ancient Egypt, was something I had studied diligently, poring over diagrams and fragmented examples, but never had I worked with actual documents. The weight of this initial assignment settled upon me. My entire aspiration rested on my ability to decipher these unfamiliar characters and bring order to them. It was among these Egyptian administrative records that I found it, a weathered piece of decree, its surface covered in markings I recognized as Egyptian hieroglyphs at the top, followed by a cursive script, and then a third, unfamiliar lettering at the bottom. The decree was damaged, a section missing, but the presence of 3 distinct scripts immediately sparked a profound sense of discovery within me. I recalled my lectures on comparative philology, the painstaking process of identifying linguistic relationships and tracing their evolution. This decree, I felt with a certainty that vibrated through me, held the key to understanding one of these unknown scripts. My focus narrowed entirely onto this single artifact. The days blurred into a rhythm of meticulous comparison and careful notation. I worked with an intensity that made me forget my surroundings, my fingers tracing the lines of ink on brittle papyrus, my mind wrestling with the patterns and forms of each script. I would align fragments, searching for common sounds or grammatical structures, cross-referencing them with what little I knew of ancient Egyptian linguistic families. The frustration when a crucial symbol was missing was immense, but each small breakthrough, each newly recognized word or phrase brought a surge of exhilaration. This methodical process, born from my earlier academic training, was now being tested in the most demanding and rewarding way possible. My diligent work on the decree, though time-consuming and intellectually taxing, did not go unnoticed. A senior scholar, whom I knew by reputation as the keeper of Egyptian antiquities, approached me as I was carefully unfurling the damaged document. He was a man of formidable presence, his gaze sharp and discerning. While he acknowledged my effort, his tone carried a subtle, almost imperceptible edge of displeasure. He spoke of established methods and the proper channels for new discoveries, implying, without directly stating, that my independent efforts were perhaps premature. It was my first encounter with the intricate web of personalities and territorial claims that seemed to govern even the most scholarly of institutions. Following this initial success, my patron, pleased with my progress, secured me limited access to a section of the Great Hall of Scrolls. The sheer immensity of it was breathtaking. Rows upon rows of papyrus scrolls, neatly catalogued and organized, stretched as far as my eyes could see, filling shelves that rose towards the vaulted ceiling. The air carried a dry, faint aroma, a scent that spoke of age and preservation, a tangible reminder of the countless hours spent by scholars before me. The polished marble beneath my feet offered a cool contrast to the rougher surfaces of the scrolls I handled. I overheard hushed conversations among other scholars, discussions of new arrivals from distant lands, each mention fueling my wonder about the breadth of human knowledge contained within these fragile containers. My assigned task then shifted to a more complex endeavor, the reconstruction of a historical chronicle that had been scattered across numerous fragmented scrolls. This was a monumental undertaking, demanding not only a deep understanding of historical events, but also a rigorous application of textual criticism. I had to identify overlapping passages, recognize subtle variations in accounts, and discern authentic narratives from interpolations or outright errors introduced over time. The importance of this work lay in its potential to recover lost history, to bring to light events and perspectives that had been obscured by the passage of years, and the responsibility of ensuring its accuracy weighed heavily. The senior scholar, the keeper of Egyptian antiquities, resurfaced as I delved deeper into the fragmented chronicle. During a gathering where scholars presented their ongoing research, he raised a series of pointed questions regarding the authenticity of certain fragments I had identified as crucial to the chronicle's reconstruction. His critique was sharp, couched in the language of scholarly debate, but the implication was clear. He was casting doubt upon my findings and, by extension, my competence. I found myself compelled to defend my methodology, detailing the careful process by which I had authenticated each piece. The professional stakes of this exchange were immense, as my reputation and my access to further resources within the library hung in the balance. Seeking to clarify a particularly obscure reference within the chronicle, a mention of a forgotten trade route, I was directed to an older librarian who oversaw a less frequented section of the archives. He was a man of quiet demeanor, his hands gnarled but his eyes sharp with intelligence. He provided the precise details I needed, but also offered a veiled warning, speaking of how certain knowledge within the library was not merely collected, but also protected, sometimes from those who might misuse it. His words, spoken in a low, measured tone, hinted at a deeper layer to the library's purpose, a role in safeguarding information that extended beyond simple preservation, planting a seed of unease about the purity of its mission. My duties, then, extended to the scriptorium, the vital hub where scrolls were meticulously copied and restored. Witnessing the painstaking work of the scribes brought home the physical reality of knowledge preservation. I learned about the different qualities of papyrus, the preparation of inks, and the careful techniques used to mend brittle edges, each process demanding immense patience and precision. I also observed the complex cataloging systems employed, gaining a clearer understanding of the library's internal organization and the crucial role played by every individual, from the most renowned scholar to the humblest scribe. It was also here that I first learned of the subtle art of forgery within the trade of ancient texts, a reminder that not all that appeared authentic truly was. While examining a recent consignment of scrolls originating from a newly incorporated territory, I uncovered something that chilled me to the bone. Annotations and cross-references within several historical accounts pointed to deliberate alterations, to passages that had been systematically removed or rewritten to support a particular political narrative. It became clear that the very histories I was tasked with preserving were being subtly manipulated to serve the interests of those in power. This discovery ignited a deep internal conflict within me. My commitment to the honest preservation and dissemination of knowledge clashed starkly with the apparent need for political expediency and secrecy that seemed to permeate certain aspects of the library's operations. The discovery of these suppressed texts presented me with a difficult choice. Protocol dictated that I should re-archive them without comment, effectively burying the truth and maintaining the current political narrative. However, my core values as a scholar, my very reason for being in Alexandria, urged me to act differently. Part of me craved the safety of following the established order, but another, more deeply rooted part felt an undeniable obligation to historical integrity. I wrestled with the potential consequences, jeopardizing my position, alienating my patron, and possibly even facing personal danger. In the end, I chose to subtly mark the original fragments, securing them in a way that might allow for their future rediscovery, a quiet act of defiance against intellectual censorship. To further cement my place within the library and to demonstrate my growing expertise, I was entrusted with the critical task of authenticating a collection of ancient philosophical treatises. This required a rigorous approach, involving comparative analysis of writing styles, the meticulous tracing of each manuscript's provenance, its history of ownership and transmission, and the identification of any inconsistencies that might suggest forgery or misattribution. My ability to detect pseudepigrapha, writings falsely attributed to famous authors, was put to the ultimate test. The intellectual challenge was immense, and a misstep could have irrevocably damaged my professional credibility. During the intricate process of authenticating the philosophical texts, I found myself working alongside another young scholar who specialized in a different, yet complementary, area of ancient languages. We discovered a shared dedication to scholarly rigor and a mutual suspicion of the underlying political currents within the library. By sharing our findings and insights, we were able to overcome particularly challenging passages and resolve complex authentication problems together. This collaboration provided not only valuable academic support, but also a much-needed perspective on navigating the subtle rivalries and hidden agendas that seem to operate beneath the surface of the library's serene facade. My time in Alexandria began to extend beyond the quiet halls of the Mausion, allowing me to experience the city itself as a vibrant extension of the knowledge I was studying. I wandered through the bustling markets where the exotic spices and rare goods traded by merchants echoed descriptions found in the scrolls I examined, giving the written words a tangible reality. The distant sounds of the busy Alexandrian port served as a constant reminder of the vast interconnected world from which these precious texts originated. This immersion into the city's life deepened my understanding of the historical context that shaped the knowledge contained within the library. Having navigated the complexities of scholarly politics, demonstrated my dedication through arduous tasks, and made difficult ethical decisions regarding suppressed knowledge, I was finally offered a permanent position as a curator within the great library. Reflecting on my journey, I recognized how I had transformed from a hopeful newcomer into a scholar keenly aware of the immense responsibility that came with safeguarding history. I accepted the position not solely for the prestige, but with a renewed and profound commitment to the library's true purpose, the preservation and eventual unveiling of knowledge, even when that truth proved inconvenient or dangerous. My personal ambition had matured into a deep-seated dedication to a cause far greater than myself. This encounter with the subtle manipulation of historical records lingered in my thoughts. The weight of my patron's expectations felt as tangible as the smooth stones underfoot as I stepped through the outer courtyard of the Mausean. This grand precinct, dedicated to the Muses, was the intellectual heart of Alexandria, and my entry marked the true beginning of my aspirations to join its scholarly custodians. A brief, almost formal introduction to the complex had occurred just days ago, offering a fleeting glimpse of its quiet industry, a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos of the city. Now, I was to face the process, a path I knew would be far from simple, demanding that I prove my worth beyond mere scholarly ambition. My prior studies had equipped me with a solid foundation in understanding ancient texts and a command of several classical tongues, tools I believed would serve me well in cataloging and preserving the vast repository of knowledge here. Yet, upon receiving my initial assignment, the sheer scale of the challenge became apparent. I was to undertake the cataloging of a small collection of recently acquired Egyptian administrative documents, a task that required immediate engagement with a script I had only encountered in theoretical study, Demotic. This cursive Egyptian script, commonly used for everyday purposes, presented a formidable first hurdle, and I understood clearly that any misstep here could see my dreams of tenure evaporate before they could truly form. The scrolls themselves, bundled tightly with rough twine, smelled faintly of dry earth and something vaguely spicy, a scent quite different from the crisp papyrus I'd previously known. As I carefully unrolled the first brittle sheet, revealing rows of unfamiliar characters, a wave of apprehension washed over me. These were not the polished verses of Homer or the measured prose of Plato. These were the practical records of a distant administration, a testament to the practical uses of writing that often went uncelebrated. My patron, a man of considerable influence and quiet generosity, had invested greatly in my journey, and the unspoken understanding was that failure to impress would mean a loss of his valuable favor. My task was to meticulously identify, describe, and organize these administrative records, a process that demanded more than just linguistic skill. It required a keen eye for detail, an understanding of bureaucratic structures that spanned millennia, and the ability to discern subtle variations within the Demotic script itself. I had spent countless hours poring over what limited examples of Demotic were available in Greece, practicing the graceful, flowing lines of its letters. But theory and practice often diverge, and I braced myself for this divergence. As I worked, the soft rustling of papyrus becoming a familiar sound, I found myself surprisingly drawn into the content of these documents. One particular bundle contained tax records, detailing levies on grain and livestock, and I could almost picture the bustling markets and the farmers bringing their produce. It was a tangible connection to lives lived long ago, and a gentle joke from a fellow junior scholar passing by, remarking on my apparent fascination with agricultural yields, brought a brief smile to my lips, reminding me that even the most serious work could hold moments of levity. The initial steps in cataloging involved carefully unrolling each scroll, smoothing out any creases, and examining the script for its clarity and completeness. Then came the painstaking work of transcription, carefully noting the forms of individual characters and any recurring phrases or names. It was during this meticulous process that I encountered a document unlike the others. It was a larger fragment, bearing not just Demotic, but also two other scripts I recognized from my studies: hieroglyphic, the formal pictographic script, and a more scholarly form of Greek. This trilingual inscription, a partial decree, immediately captured my attention. Its existence hinted at a potential connection between these different systems of writing, a possibility that resonated deeply with my training in comparative philology. The idea of finding a key, much like the famed Rosetta Stone spoken of in hushed academic circles, began to form in my mind. This was an unexpected avenue, a deviation from my assigned cataloging, but the scholar in me urged me to investigate further. I felt a pull between my direct duties and this intriguing discovery. The administrative documents still lay before me, awaiting their proper catalyzation, a task that would likely please my superiors and demonstrate my adherence to protocol. However, the prospect of deciphering a text that potentially bridged distinct linguistic worlds was a more compelling intellectual pursuit. I knew that my proficiency in recognizing grammatical structures and tracing etymological connections could be crucial here. But the fear of overstepping my bounds and incurring further disfavor, particularly from those already observing my progress with a critical eye, weighed heavily upon me. The fragmented decree, though partially damaged, offered tantalizing clues. I began by comparing the Greek text to the Egyptian scripts, looking for recognizable names or titles that might serve as anchor points. My fingers, stained with the faint brown of old ink, moved over the papyrus with deliberate care. I remembered a specific lesson on the importance of contextual understanding when dealing with multilingual inscriptions, where cultural practices and political pronouncements often dictated the parallel nature of the texts. This task of decipherment was a solitary endeavor, requiring immense concentration. Unlike the collaborative atmosphere of my earlier introduction to the Mausean, I was now keenly aware of the quiet vigilance of the more established scholars. I was in a less frequented annex, my presence marked by the faint, dry scent of aged papyrus that clung to everything. The work was slow, each symbol a piece of a larger, intricate puzzle, and I found myself wrestling with the potential for error. A misplaced accent in Greek or a misunderstanding of a demotic ligature could send my entire interpretation astray, and the thought of presenting an inaccurate translation was a humbling one. My dedication to this task, however, led to an unforeseen consequence. Word of my efforts with the trilingual fragment reached a senior scholar, a respected figure known for his extensive work on Egyptian inscriptions, whose name I had heard mentioned with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He approached me some days later, his demeanor polite, but his questions pointed. He inquired about my sources and my methodology, his words creating a subtle but undeniable undercurrent of professional scrutiny. It became clear that my independent exploration had not gone unnoticed, and that navigating the academic landscape here would involve more than just mastering ancient scripts. It would require understanding the ambitions and rivalries that lay beneath the surface of scholarly pursuit. I knew then that my path to becoming a curator would be as much about diplomacy as it was about dedication to knowledge. While working on those initial Egyptian administrative documents, a task assigned to gauge my aptitude with unfamiliar scripts, my fingers brushed against something rougher than the usual papyrus. Carefully unfurling the brittle sheet, I saw it was not a standard administrative record, but rather a stone fragment, partially broken, yet bearing a surprising inscription. It was unlike anything I had encountered in my Greek studies, or even my theoretical work on Eastern languages. This fragment, unlike the orderly papyri I was accustomed to, felt like a physical puzzle unearthed from the very earth of this ancient land. As I examined it more closely, my eyes widened with recognition. 3 distinct bands of script were carved into the stone, one above the other, each composed of entirely different symbols and characters. My training in comparative philology, the study of related languages and historical development of language, immediately recognized the potential for something truly extraordinary. Remembering my academic mentor's emphasis on the importance of finding parallels across linguistic families, I carefully set aside the administrative scrolls. This stone decree, even in its damaged state, whispered of connections previously unseen. I felt a surge of intellectual excitement, a familiar warmth that always accompanied the possibility of bridging a gap in understanding. This was not merely cataloging. This was an invitation to decipher. I began by meticulously comparing the symbols in the topmost script, which appeared to be a form of hieroglyphs, with the middle band, a more cursive, flowing script that I suspected might be demotic, the very script I was struggling to master. The process was slow, requiring immense concentration as I cross-referenced every character, looking for recurring patterns, any hint of a shared origin or meaning between the two. The air in my small workspace grew still as I leaned closer, my breathing shallow with focus. The challenges were immediate and immense. Several key symbols in the hieroglyphic section were chipped away, leaving me to infer their meaning from context. Similarly, gaps in the demotic script made direct comparison difficult. Frustration was a constant companion during these initial stages, a gnawing worry that I might be chasing a phantom of connection, a pattern that existed only in my hopeful imagination. Yet, with each hour spent, with each meticulous comparison, a thread began to emerge. I observed that certain groups of symbols in the hieroglyphs seemed to correspond to certain sequences of characters in the demotic. This burgeoning correspondence, though tentative, fueled my determination. I recalled how scholars in Greece had painstakingly pieced together the meaning of ancient inscriptions by finding a key, a known text that mirrored an unknown one. The third and final script, at the bottom of the stone, was the most perplexing. It was entirely different from the other two, with angular, almost block-like characters. I had encountered references to this script, possibly a form of ancient Greek, but had never had the opportunity to work with it directly. The presence of this third inscription, if it indeed held a related meaning, was the ultimate promise of this discovery. I dedicated my evenings, after completing my assigned cataloging tasks, to this singular pursuit. My patron's investment in my studies, the unspoken expectation of success, weighed on me. But the lure of this linguistic puzzle was stronger. I knew that a poor performance on the administrative documents would end my time here, but succeeding with this decree could open doors I had only dreamed of. This was more than just scholarly curiosity. It was a test of my very place within these hallowed halls. The library's vastness, which had initially seemed an overwhelming repository of knowledge, now felt like a fertile ground for such discoveries. The sheer volume of texts, the countless scrolls from every corner of the known world, surely held many such linguistic bridges waiting to be found. This single fragment, however, felt particularly potent, a testament to the layers of history and communication that existed before my own time. As I painstakingly transcribed the symbols, I began to form hypotheses. Could this decree be a proclamation issued by a ruler, intended for different populations within his domain, each served by their own language? The thought was exhilarating. It suggested a deliberate act of communication across linguistic divides, something that mirrored the very purpose of this great library, albeit in a much older context. The process of deciphering became a deeply personal experience, a conversation across centuries. I felt the effort of the original stone carvers, the careful planning that must have gone into selecting these distinct scripts. It was a privilege to engage with their work, to try and understand the message they had intended to convey, a message that had lain silent and largely unread for ages. My own expertise in identifying subtle linguistic markers and understanding the evolution of character forms was put to its greatest test. I recalled a lecture on the influence of early Greek colonists on local Egyptian administrative practices. Could this stone, discovered among the new acquisitions, be a direct result of such historical interactions? A document marking a specific period of cultural exchange? My scholarly journey had always been driven by a desire to understand the past, to connect the dots of human history. This unexpected fragment, lying amongst seemingly mundane records, presented an unparalleled opportunity. It was a tangible link to a past I was only beginning to comprehend, and the personal challenge of unlocking its secrets was now as significant as my initial ambition to join the library's esteemed ranks. My philological training had led me to this unexpected moment. My successful deciphering of the Egyptian decree, a task that had occupied my every waking thought for days, had indeed brought a flicker of recognition. It wasn't the grand applause I might have dreamed of back in Greece, but rather a quiet nod from a senior curator passing through the scriptorium where I was still stationed. This small acknowledgement, however, was quickly overshadowed by a new presence. A scholar whose reputation for swift judgments and a fierce defense of his own intellectual territory preceded him. He observed me from across the hall, his gaze sharp, and later, during a shared meal of lentils and dried figs in the Mauseans' refectory, he made his presence known. He spoke of the decree, but his words carried a distinct edge, a subtle questioning of my approach, as if my independent work was an intrusion into established boundaries. I felt a distinct prickle of unease, a realization that my journey here was becoming less about pure scholarship and more about navigating the human currents that flowed beneath the quiet pursuit of knowledge. The senior scholar, whose name was whispered with a mixture of respect and apprehension among the younger scholars, made a point of seeking me out near the scroll racks a few days later. He gestured towards a shelf holding a collection of papyri attributed to a renowned philosopher. "These," he began, his voice carrying an unearned air of authority, "are delicate matters. Their lineage, their very essence, requires a seasoned hand to discern their truth." He then steered the conversation back to my deciphering efforts, remarking, "While your recent work on the Egyptian script shows promise, one must be careful not to presume too much too soon. Some linguistic puzzles are best left to those who have wrestled with them for decades." His words were polite on the surface, but the undertow was clear. He was establishing his domain, and I, with my curious pursuit of the decree, had inadvertently trespassed. This interaction solidified my growing suspicion that academic advancement here involved more than just diligent study. It required a keen understanding of the established hierarchies and the formidable personalities that guarded them. Following this unsettling encounter, I felt a subtle shift in my access to certain areas within the Mausean. While I was still permitted to study, the whispered conversations that previously included me now seemed to halt when I approached, and the scholars who once offered a welcoming smile now offered polite but distant nods. It was as if a quiet signal had been passed, a subtle exclusion. This realization brought with it a prickle of anxiety, particularly as I recalled my patron's generous investment in my journey. Failure to impress, or worse, to alienate those in power, would have tangible consequences beyond my own bruised pride. I found myself more acutely aware of my surroundings, my steps measured, my contributions to any group discussion carefully considered. The vibrant intellectual atmosphere I had initially admired now seemed to carry an undercurrent of competition, a silent struggle for influence and recognition. The senior scholar's influence extended even to the distribution of new tasks. While my initial assignment with the administrative documents had been challenging but manageable, the more promising and complex assignments now seemed to bypass me, going instead to scholars who had been in Alexandria for years. I observed them receiving freshly acquired texts from distant lands, their faces alight with the prospect of new discoveries. My own days, therefore, continued to be filled with the meticulous, often solitary work of cataloging and cross-referencing existing materials. I tried to find solace and satisfaction in this foundational work, reminding myself that even the most renowned scholars began with the basics. Yet the sting of being overlooked, coupled with the senior scholar's subtly dismissive demeanor, left a small but persistent shadow on my ambition. This was not the open, collaborative scholarly environment I had envisioned. One afternoon, while poring over a collection of astronomical charts that had arrived from Babylon, I stumbled upon an annotation that seemed out of place. It was a short, cryptic phrase written in a script I recognized as an archaic form of Greek, tucked away in the margin of a diagram depicting planetary movements. Intrigued, I gently unfolded the fragile papyrus, my fingers moving with the utmost care. The phrase spoke of celestial alignments predicting earthly shifts, a concept that, while not entirely unheard of, was phrased with a peculiar urgency. I spent the next hour trying to decipher the full context of the annotation, cross-referencing it with other astronomical texts. This small deviation from my assigned tasks felt like a secret adventure, a moment of personal discovery in the midst of my subtle professional isolation. And I wondered if this was the sort of unexpected finding that truly marked a scholar's worth, or merely a distraction from the path laid out for me. The task of deciphering this marginal note proved more engaging than the previous decree, for it involved not just linguistic skill, but also a deep understanding of ancient astronomical theories. I consulted with a junior scribe who specialized in celestial mapping, a young man who seemed more interested in the practical application of knowledge than in the internal politics of the Mausean. He shared his own observations on how such annotations might have been used, suggesting they could be mnemonic devices, or perhaps even coded messages. We spent a quiet afternoon together in a small alcove, the air carrying the faint, dry aroma of aged papyrus, comparing the scribe's detailed charts with the philosopher's weather diagrams. This collaboration felt like a breath of fresh air, a reminder that genuine intellectual curiosity could still flourish amidst the more guarded personalities of the library. It also offered a welcome distraction from the growing awareness of the subtle rivalries at play. My clandestine study of the astronomical annotation led me to a particular passage in a historical account of the Ptolemaic era, detailing the courtly intrigues surrounding the succession of rulers. The text, painstakingly copied by a diligent scribe, described a period of intense political maneuvering, where seemingly minor decisions had far-reaching consequences. As I read, I couldn't help but draw parallels between the ancient court and the subtle power plays I was beginning to witness within the Mausean. It felt as though the same human nature, with its ambitions and insecurities, operated regardless of the century. This historical perspective provided a strange sort of comfort, suggesting that navigating such dynamics was, in a way, part of the timeless scholarly pursuit, not merely a personal challenge I was facing. It was a rather amusing thought, considering the quiet dignity usually associated with libraries. The senior scholar, it seemed, had a keen eye for anything that might draw attention away from his own established work. A few days after my brief collaboration with the scribe on the astronomical charts, he approached me again, this time with a different matter. He presented me with a small bundle of papyri, seemingly innocuous administrative records from a provincial governor. "A simple matter of proper cataloging," he explained, his tone almost patronizing. "Ensure each entry is correctly dated and the names of officials are rendered with precise spelling. The details, you see, are paramount." He then added, with a disarming smile, "Make sure no extraneous notes are made. These are to be filed away, not studied." The implication was clear. My independent explorations were to be curtailed, and I was to return to the more mundane, assigned tasks, lest I draw further unfavorable attention. This directive, while frustrating, also presented a curious opportunity. As I began the meticulous work of cataloging the provincial records, I noticed a recurring pattern in the names of certain subordinate officials. They appeared in different contexts, sometimes associated with trade disputes, other times with troop movements. It was the very kind of detailed cross-referencing that the senior scholar seemed eager to discourage. One particular name, a minor tax collector named Lycon, appeared with unusual frequency, often near records detailing the acquisition of rare goods or shipments of unusual quantities of grain. While I told myself I was merely fulfilling the cataloging requirement, a small voice of curiosity, the same one that had been drawn to the cryptic annotation on the astronomical chart, began to whisper. It felt as though these mundane records held a faint echo of something more significant, a secret waiting to be unearthed. As I continued to meticulously record each transaction and appointment, a rather unexpected observation emerged. Lycon, the tax collector, seemed to be involved in the procurement of materials for the library itself, specifically for the scriptorium. He was listed as having acquired large quantities of specialized papyrus reeds and pigments for ink. This struck me as peculiar, as such details were usually handled by more senior administrative staff. The more I cross-referenced Lycon's involvement, the more it seemed to intertwine with the movement of valuable commodities, some of which were mentioned in the administrative records as being gifts or tributes. It made me wonder about the true nature of these transactions, and if my focus on the seemingly dry details was leading me to a more complex reality, hidden within the library's operations, a reality the senior scholar perhaps wished to keep obscured. The knowledge I'd gained felt both heavy and precious. The curator granted me a brief tour beyond the initial reception halls, leading me into a section of the Great Hall of Scrolls that made my breath catch. Towering shelves, carved from dark, smooth wood, stretched upwards as far as I could see, disappearing into the high arched ceiling. They were filled with countless papyrus scrolls, each one a tightly bound cylinder, standing neatly in rows like sleeping guardians of knowledge. A faint, dry aroma of aged papyrus, mingled with a trace of cedar wood used in the shelving, reached my nostrils, a scent I found deeply comforting. The marble floor beneath my sandals felt cool and solid, a stark contrast to the dusty paths I had traveled to reach this hallowed place. My guide indicated the sheer scale of the collection, explaining how each scroll was carefully documented and stored according to its subject matter and origin. I noted how scholars, moving with a quiet reverence, would approach certain shelves, their fingers tracing the inscribed labels with a practiced touch. The hushed murmurs of their conversations, often in Greek or the melodic tones of Egyptian, spoke of intense intellectual engagement, a world away from the clamor of the city I had left behind. This ordered vastness, so different from the scattered, cherished texts of my home academy, hinted at the immense effort required to manage and preserve such a treasure trove. As we moved deeper, I overheard two scholars discussing a recent acquisition from the distant land of Serica, a place famed for its silk and exotic spices. Their animated, though still subdued, tones described the remarkable delicacy of the papyrus used and the intricate characters that filled its surface, suggesting a completely different writing tradition. This brief exchange sparked a wave of curiosity within me, a longing to understand what other cultures had recorded, what unique perspectives were hidden within these yet uncatalogued rolls. It was a powerful reminder of how much of the world remained unknown, its stories waiting to be uncovered. Following this brief glimpse, I returned to my assigned tasks, but the image of those endless shelves remained etched in my mind. The sheer volume of preserved thought, of accumulated human experience, was humbling. It impressed upon me the weighty responsibility I was beginning to shoulder. My patron's expectation for my success, which had felt like a heavy cloak, now seemed interwoven with the broader duty of safeguarding these fragile vessels of history. My personal ambition to prove my worth felt inextricably linked to the preservation of this shared legacy. My work, preparing newly arrived administrative records, continued for several days. One afternoon, as I carefully unfurled a brittle roll detailing grain shipments from the Fayoum region, I found myself listening to the gentle rustling sounds the papyrus made. It was a sound that spoke of age and of patient endurance. The ink, faded in places but still legible, described transactions and provisions that painted a picture of daily life centuries before. This practical engagement with the past, through the tangible evidence of these documents, offered a different kind of learning, one that grounded my theoretical knowledge. During these quiet hours of cataloging, I sometimes heard the distant cry of peacocks from the Dardans that were part of the Mausion complex. Their sharp calls, cutting through the otherwise tranquil atmosphere, were a constant reminder of the living world that coexisted with the silent wisdom of the scrolls. These natural sounds, so different from the academic discussions, grounded me in the present moment, a necessary counterpoint to the deep immersion required for my work. They also offered a brief respite, allowing my mind to momentarily wander before returning to the intricate task at hand. The meticulous nature of the work, however, demanded intense focus. I learned to distinguish the subtle variations in the script, identifying different scribal hands and the particular methods used for marking corrections or additions. This detailed observation, I realized, was not merely about following instructions. It was about developing a deeper appreciation for the skill and dedication of those who had penned these words so long ago. Each carefully drawn character held a story, not just of the information it conveyed, but of the person who committed it to papyrus. This close examination also highlighted the immense value placed on each individual scroll. The careful way they were handled, the specific conditions under which they were stored, underscored their perceived fragility and importance. I recalled how back in Greece, texts were often shared, copied eagerly, and sometimes treated with less ceremony. Here, the very air seemed to resonate with a reverence for the written word, a profound respect for the transmission of knowledge across generations. This atmosphere of deep respect left a lasting impression on my understanding of scholarship itself. This adventure had changed how I saw the preservation of knowledge itself. The task the senior curator set before me was a daunting one, a significant step up from the administrative documents of the previous weeks. He presented me with a large wooden chest, its surface weathered and etched with the journey it had clearly undertaken. Inside, nestled amongst dried herbs meant to deter pests, lay a collection of papyrus fragments, each brittle and yellowed with age. My assignment, he explained with a slight curl of his lip, was to attempt to reconstruct a lost historical chronicle detailing the early days of a forgotten dynasty. This, he added, would truly test my skills in textual criticism, a subject I had studied with great fervor back in Greece, but had only recently begun to apply in this vibrant, overwhelming city. To reconstruct this chronicle meant more than just reading words. It required understanding the context and the very act of writing itself. The way a scribe's hand might falter, or a damp scroll might cause ink to bleed into neighboring lines. I laid out the pieces on a broad table, the soft, cool marble a welcome sensation after the rough wood of the chest. My patron's expectations, a quiet but persistent pressure, reminded me that failure here would mean a significant loss of his esteemed favor, and with it, my chances of continued patronage for my work within this legendary institution. I began by carefully unrolling the largest fragment, its edges frayed like ancient lace, and the air around me filled with the faint, dry aroma of aged papyrus. My initial work involved meticulous sorting, grouping fragments that seemed to share similar ink hues or the particular style of a scribe's letter formation. It felt like piecing together a shattered pot, each shard holding a hint of the original vessel. I discovered that understanding the dialect and even the common mistakes made by scribes from specific regions could help date a piece and place it within a larger narrative. This process demanded immense patience, a quality I found myself constantly drawing upon, especially when a particularly promising section would end abruptly, the story cut short by a tear in the papyrus or the slow decay of time. As I worked, I noticed a pattern emerging, a recurring mention of a particular king and his seemingly miraculous victory over a neighboring kingdom. However, when comparing this account with other smaller fragments that spoke of the same era, a discrepancy began to surface. One particular piece, smaller than the rest and tucked away at the bottom of the chest, described a devastating defeat, a tale of strategic blunders and a king's hasty retreat. This stark contrast immediately sparked my professional curiosity, hinting at more than just simple historical record-keeping at play. The challenge lay in discerning which account, if either, represented the true historical record, and which might be an embellishment or outright fabrication. My training in textual criticism taught me to look for subtle signs, the use of overly dramatic language, the absence of verifiable details, or the convenient omission of inconvenient facts. I found myself wrestling with the idea that history itself could be shaped, deliberately altered to present a more favorable or triumphant narrative, a thought that felt deeply unsettling given my own devotion to unbiased scholarship. It felt rather like trying to find a single clear thread in a tangled ball of wool. After days of careful comparison, I began to reconstruct a coherent narrative from the fragments that spoke of defeat. I meticulously noted the specific wording used to describe the king's actions and the outcome of the battle, cross-referencing it with linguistic nuances I had encountered in other unrelated texts. The faint scent of dried chamomile, still clinging to some of the papyrus, served as a constant reminder of the efforts taken to preserve these delicate pieces of the past. This careful dissection of words and phrases, understanding the subtle implications of each choice of inscription, was the heart of my work here. This second narrative, the one that spoke of a hidden truth, seemed to be deliberately obscured. It was written in a slightly more archaic script, and some sections appeared deliberately smudged, as if an attempt had been made to erase them. I found a peculiar interest in a particularly thorny passage that seemed to describe a clandestine meeting between opposing forces, a detail that completely contradicted the heroic portrayal of the king's victory. The sheer effort required to decipher these deliberately obscured passages felt like a personal testament to the value of uncovering what might have been hidden. The process of piecing together these disparate accounts felt akin to assembling a complex mosaic where each tiny broken piece had to be placed just so to reveal the larger image. I discovered that by focusing on the personal accounts of soldiers mentioned in the fragments, those who seemed to offer a more grounded perspective of events, I could begin to see the outlines of a different historical reality. It was in these moments, when a consistent personal experience emerged from the fragmented texts, that my own dedication to the pursuit of historical accuracy felt most profoundly rewarded. It was then that I unearthed a final, almost overlooked fragment tucked deep within a fold of papyrus. It contained a short annotation, a personal note from a scribe from a much later period, lamenting the deliberate suppression of certain historical accounts concerning this very dynasty. The scribe expressed sorrow that the true story, like a river forced underground, was made to disappear. This small annotation served not only to confirm my suspicions, but also to imbue the task with a deeper sense of purpose, a feeling that I was not just cataloging, but actively recovering lost voices. Carrying the understanding of these deliberately altered narratives with me, I carefully re-rolled the fragments, the weight of this potential historical truth settling upon my shoulders. My efforts to reconstruct the fragmented chronicle had recently drawn the attention of the senior scholar, whose rivalry with me had begun to simmer since my deciphering of the trilingual decree. He approached me one afternoon as I sat at my appointed table within the Great Hall of Scrolls, a place usually filled with the soft rustle of papyrus and the hushed murmurs of scholars. His presence, however, cast a different sort of shadow, one of intellectual contention rather than quiet contemplation. He gestured toward the pile of papyrus fragments I had been meticulously assembling, his expression one of carefully controlled disapproval. "You seem overly confident in your reconstruction," he stated, his voice pitched low but carrying across the otherwise still space. "Are you certain these pieces belong to the same narrative? Some of these joins appear questionable based on my own study of similar administrative records from that period." He picked up a sliver of papyrus, its edge frayed and brittle, and pointed to a faint ink mark that I had interpreted as a continuation of a king's lineage. His words were a direct challenge to the painstaking work I had undertaken, suggesting my methodology was flawed and my conclusions premature. This accusation struck at the very core of my purpose here, my patron's trust and my own reputation riding on the accuracy of my scholarship. The consequence of such a professional failing would be significant, potentially halting my progress within the Mausean entirely and certainly diminishing my patron's favor. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I considered the weight of his words, knowing that a poor defense could indeed jeopardize everything I had worked for since arriving in this great city. His raised eyebrow and slight smirk indicated he was keenly aware of the pressure he was applying, relishing this moment of professional scrutiny. I found myself needing to articulate not just my conclusions, but the very foundation of my reasoning, demonstrating the logical progression that had led me to connect these disparate pieces. "My lord," I began, my voice steady despite the internal tremor, "the scribal hand in these two fragments, though separated by time and condition, shares distinct characteristics in the formation of the letter Aleph and the peculiar flourish at the end of the word for decree. Furthermore, the repetition of certain administrative formulae specific to the reign of that particular pharaoh appears in both sections, suggesting a continuity of record-keeping style. The scholar, however, was not easily swayed. He countered by pointing out a subtle difference in the density of the ink, suggesting it might indicate a different scribe or even a later period of composition. He then introduced a detail from a text he claimed to have personally examined, a supposed cross-reference that seemed to place the events I was chronicling in a different geographical region entirely. This felt less like a genuine critique and more like a deliberate attempt to create doubt, to sow seeds of uncertainty about my findings and my ability to interpret them correctly. This maneuver presented a significant hurdle, forcing me to divert my attention from the chronicle itself to defending my very approach. I realized that navigating the intellectual landscape of the library was as crucial as mastering its textual content. The personal stakes were not merely about accurately reconstructing history, but about proving my worth within this esteemed institution and its complex social hierarchy. My patron's investment in my journey meant that failure here would reflect poorly not only on myself, but on his judgment as well, a consideration that added considerable weight to my defense. I decided to address his point about the ink density directly, explaining that variations in ink quality were common, influenced by factors such as the availability of pigment and the preparation of the papyrus itself. I then took a risk, referencing a lesser-known, but in my experience, highly reliable treatise on ancient ink production that detailed such variances. This also allowed me to subtly introduce a tangential piece of evidence related to geographical markers, a detail that had previously seemed minor, but now served to reinforce my original placement of the chronicle's events, effectively countering his geographical assertion. The scholar's posture shifted slightly, his initial air of confidence replaced by a more scrutinizing gaze, indicating that my response had at least made him pause. While he did not immediately concede, his pointed questions became more focused, less of a broad dismissal and more of a dissection of specific points. This engagement, though tense, was a necessary part of the process, forcing me to refine my arguments and solidify my understanding of the text's historical context. It was a trial by fire, testing not just my knowledge, but my ability to stand firm under intellectual pressure. What I began to understand, however, was that this challenge was not solely about the merits of my scholarly work. It was also about the inherent competition for recognition and resources within the Mausean. The scholar's efforts to discredit my findings, while cloaked in the guise of academic rigor, also served to elevate his own perceived expertise and control over specific domains of knowledge. My nascent success with the fragmented chronicle, coupled with my earlier work on the trilingual decree, had evidently positioned me as a potential rival in his eyes, prompting this deliberate attempt to check my advancement. My journey to uncover lost histories was now intertwined with a more immediate, personal struggle for recognition and position. My mission to reconstruct the fragmented chronicle had taken an unexpected turn towards defending my scholarly integrity. The senior scholar, whose name was Theron, made his presence known during the review of the fragmented chronicle. He stood at the far end of the table, his posture rigid, and cleared his throat with a sound that suggested a mountain crumbling. He did not approach directly, but his pronouncements carried across the room as if shouted from a distant hill, questioning the very foundation of my work. He spoke of certain faded markings on the papyrus, suggesting they were not the remnants of a forgotten scribe's careful annotation, but rather recent imperfections, perhaps even clumsy additions, rather than evidence of an earlier, more complete text. My stomach tightened at his words. Theron had a reputation for defending his own interpretations with a ferocity that bordered on obsession, and it seemed my attempt to reconstruct this historical account had intruded upon his domain. While I believed my methodical approach, comparing variations in scribal hands and the chemical breakdown of the ink, provided a sound basis for my conclusions, his public doubt was a formidable obstacle. The scholars gathered around the table, their faces impassive, represented the jury for my nascent career, and Theron's pronouncements were clearly swaying their opinion. I had spent weeks tracing the subtle differences in ink composition across the various fragments, a task requiring careful observation and a deep understanding of how ancient materials aged. My own patron, a man of considerable influence and quiet expectation, had supported my quest for a position here, and the thought of failing due to Theron's machinations sent a tremor of anxiety through me. I found myself needing to explain not just my findings, but the very principles of textual criticism that guided me, in a way that would penetrate the ingrained skepticism of some of my listeners. The discoloration on Fragment 7, I began, my voice steadier than I expected, is consistent with exposure to specific alkaline residues, which, when analyzed with the appropriate reagents, react differently from modern inks. This suggests a layering effect, an earlier inscription beneath the more prominent text, rather than a simple smudge. I picked up the fragment, its edges delicate and worn, and held it out for scrutiny, hoping the visual evidence would speak as clearly as my words. It felt like holding a fragile bird's egg, so easily could it crumble under the weight of disbelief. Following this, I addressed his critique regarding the apparent inconsistencies in scribal style. "The variations you note, honored Theron," I continued, choosing my words with care, "are indeed present. However, historical records indicate that scribal practices could shift even within a single monastic community or a royal chancellery over a relatively short period. We know, for instance, that the decree issued in Tyre in 188 BCE, a document I studied extensively before my arrival here, shows similar stylistic evolutions within its own lengthy inscription, likely due to multiple hands contributing to its creation over days of work. This was a widely accepted fact among scholars, a point of common ground that I hoped would anchor my argument. Theron, however, remained unconvinced. He countered by pointing to a passage on Fragment 12, where the phrasing seemed to deviate significantly from the prevailing tone of the chronicle. "This particular sentence," he declared, his voice resonating with a practiced authority, "speaks of military logistics with a brevity that is entirely out of character for the author of the surrounding sections. It suggests an interpolation, a later addition meant to clarify a strategic point rather than an original part of the narrative." He gestured with a sharp, precise movement, as if drawing a line through my carefully constructed argument. I felt a familiar frustration prickle beneath my skin, but I forced myself to remain calm, recalling the patient work of my mentors in Athens. "While the phrasing is indeed more direct," I replied, looking directly at the scholars seated around me, "we must consider the context of the siege described. Accounts from other conflicts, such as the Peloponnesian War, show that during periods of intense military action, the focus often shifted to concise, practical reporting, even among those who wrote more floridly in times of peace. This brevity, therefore, might reflect the urgency of the moment the original scribe was attempting to convey, rather than an external addition. It was a delicate balance, acknowledging his point while offering an alternative explanation, grounded in wider historical parallels. Then came the moment I dreaded, but also anticipated. Theron, with a flourish, introduced what he called a unique textual anomaly, a passage that he claimed directly contradicted a known historical event. He presented his findings with an air of triumph, as if he had unearthed irrefutable proof of my error. It was during this exchange that a peculiar detail emerged, something Theron himself seemed to overlook in his eagerness to discredit me. The disputed passage referenced a specific astronomical alignment, a conjunction of planets that, according to my own astronomical charts, occurred not during the period Theron proposed, but several years later. This subtle error in his dating, while seemingly minor, was the pivot upon which my defense turned. It was a quirk of the celestial sphere, a detail that required a specific, albeit specialized, knowledge to appreciate fully. The implications of this discovery were profound. It meant not only that Thrawn's dating was flawed, but that the chronicle itself, if my interpretation of the astronomical reference was correct, was likely far older than either of us had initially surmised. This realization brought with it a sudden, exhilarating surge of discovery, a feeling that pushed aside the immediate anxiety of the review. As the meeting concluded and the scholars began to disperse, I knew this was not the end of the matter. Thrawn's challenge had forced me to rigorously examine every aspect of my work, pushing me to consider every possible objection. The heated exchanges, though personally taxing, had sharpened my understanding of the texts and the broader currents of historical interpretation. I had defended my approach, not just with learned arguments, with a tangible piece of evidence that pointed to a deeper, more significant truth embedded within the fragmented pages. The implications of what I'd found would unfold in time. The fragmented chronicle I had been working on continued to puzzle me. While I had managed to piece together a plausible sequence of events, certain obscure references remained stubbornly opaque, like mist clinging to distant hills. One passage in particular spoke of astronomical observations tied to the founding of a minor temple, a detail that seemed out of place with the rest of the historical account. My patron had entrusted me with this task, and the unspoken pressure to succeed, to bring forgotten knowledge to light, weighed upon me. Failure meant not only disappointing him, but also admitting a certain inadequacy that I could not afford at this early stage of my career within the Mausian. Because of this, I sought guidance not within the grand halls where more senior scholars held court, but in the quieter, less frequented corners of the vast institution. My path led me away from the main study areas, down a corridor that seemed to absorb the ambient light, its walls lined with scrolls less frequently disturbed. Workers here moved with a different rhythm, their movements slow and deliberate, carrying bundles of papyrus wrapped in rough linen. The air carried a fainter, drier scent than that of the main collection, hinting at less used but perhaps more valuable contents. Following the directions suggested by a junior attendant, I found myself before a small, unassuming chamber, its doorway partially obscured by a hanging tapestry woven with geometric patterns. This was the domain of an elder librarian, a man of quiet repute, known less for his prolific output and more for his deep, almost ingrained knowledge of the library's more arcane holdings. My patron had mentioned him in passing, a repository of forgotten lore, someone who understood the true depth of the collections beyond their catalogued titles. Pushing aside the tapestry, I entered the room. The space was a revelation, not in its grandeur, but in its sheer density of papyrus. Scrolls were stacked not just on shelves, but in carefully organized piles on tables, in wooden chests, and even on the floor, each bundle tied with simple cords. A single oil lamp cast a warm, steady glow, illuminating the careful work of the librarian, who was meticulously cleaning the edge of a scroll with a soft brush. His hands, though weathered, moved with a grace that spoke of decades spent tending to these ancient texts. He looked up as I entered, his eyes, framed by crow's feet, carrying a depth of understanding. "You seek clarification on the Chronicle," he stated, his voice soft but clear, without any preamble. It was not a question, but an observation, as if my purpose had been written on my brow. He gestured to a small, empty stool near his workspace, inviting me to sit. The stone floor felt cool beneath my sandals, a welcome sensation after walking through the warmer corridors. I explained the specific passage that troubled me, the one connecting temple founding to celestial alignments. As I spoke, I noticed the librarian's gaze drift towards a particular set of scrolls nestled in a dark corner, almost hidden from view. He listened intently, his head inclined slightly, and then reached for one of these less accessible texts. It was a smaller scroll, its papyrus darkened with age, bearing a script I recognized as an archaic form of priestly writing, distinct from the demotic I had encountered earlier. "This," he began, unrolling the scroll with great care, "is a record from the period you study. It speaks of the priest's methods for determining auspicious dates. They observed the heavens not merely for prophecy, but for practical matters, the sowing of crops, the timing of festivals, and yes, the consecration of sacred sites." He pointed to a passage detailing specific stellar conjunctions. "This chronicle you study, it seems to have combined accounts from different eras, a common practice in later copying, perhaps to make the text more comprehensive." His explanation was illuminating, a perfectly fitted piece into the puzzle I had been struggling with. The practical, almost mundane reason for the astronomical detail grounded the narrative in a way that the more mystical interpretations I had considered had not. It was a testament to the subtle ways knowledge could be preserved and transmitted, sometimes through layers of context and adaptation. The dry scent of this particular papyrus was more pronounced, and I could detect a faint earthy aroma, perhaps from the damp earth it had once rested upon. As he spoke, he also shared insights into the wider purpose of such detailed records. "Knowledge is a powerful tool," he mused, his fingers tracing the faded ink, "and sometimes those who wield power find it necessary to shape how that knowledge is understood or to safeguard certain truths from those who might misuse them. This library, in its entirety, is more than a collection of scrolls. It is a repository of influence, a place where the very narratives of our world are curated and, at times, carefully managed." He paused, his gaze returning to the scroll he held. "Discretion is paramount," he continued, his tone lowering slightly, "and not all information is meant for immediate or widespread dissemination. Some truths must wait for the right time, for the right understanding to emerge. The wisdom of the ages is not always loud. Often it whispers from these quiet places, waiting to be heard by those who are truly listening." This revelation struck me with a quiet force. I had come seeking to illuminate a historical passage, to prove my academic worth through diligent study. Yet this encounter suggested a deeper current running beneath the surface of scholarly pursuit. The sheer volume of texts around us, each with its own history and potential implications, suddenly seemed more profound, more laden with consequence than I had initially perceived. The quiet hum of scholarly activity from the main halls felt distant now, replaced by the tangible presence of hidden histories. My own ambition to simply catalog and understand felt suddenly simpler, almost naive. I realized that the pursuit of knowledge within these walls was not a purely academic exercise. It was intertwined with the currents of power and influence that shaped the world outside. The very act of selecting which texts to preserve, which to emphasize, and which to let lie in quiet obscurity was itself a form of curation, a subtle shaping of collective understanding. The sheer scale of this responsibility began to dawn on me, a weight that felt heavier than any scroll. Reflecting on the librarian's words, I contemplated the many hands that had touched these texts over the centuries. Each scribe, each cataloger, each scholar had, in their own way, contributed to the narrative held within these walls. What decisions had they made? What knowledge had they deemed fit to pass on, and what had they chosen to withhold? The answer, I suspected, was as complex and layered as the papyrus itself, a testament to human intention and the inevitable passage of time. My understanding of my own role within this vast institution began to shift. It was not merely about deciphering ancient scripts or reconstructing lost chronicles. It was about recognizing the subtle influences at play, the responsibilities that came with handling such a wealth of human thought and experience. The librarian's quiet wisdom had opened a new dimension to my quest, one that extended far beyond the purely intellectual pursuit I had envisioned upon my arrival in this magnificent city. My perception of the library's purpose had gained a new, significant layer. My days in the great library, which had begun with the quiet reverence of the Mausian, now led me into the heart of its practical operations, specifically the bustling, though still orderly, scriptorium. This was where the vast ocean of knowledge housed in papyrus scrolls was carefully tended, copied, and preserved. My patron, whose faith in my abilities had brought me to this grand city, had requested I gain broader experience, and assisting the scribes offered a unique chance to understand the very fabric of the library's enduring work. It was a place of focused labor, where the smell of drying ink mingled with the fainter, dry scent of aging papyrus, a constant reminder of the weight of the texts handled. The scriptorium itself was a large, airy chamber, lit by numerous high windows that allowed a generous amount of the bright Alexandrian daylight to filter in. I observed the scribes with keen interest, their movements precise and economical as they prepared papyrus sheets, smoothed them with bone folders, and mixed their inks. These were not the glamorous debates of scholars or the thrill of deciphering ancient scripts. This was the diligent, painstaking craft of preservation, a vital role I had previously only considered in passing. I watched one scribe dip a reed pen, its tip expertly shaped, into a small clay pot of black ink, the dark liquid clinging to the fibers of the pen. My initial assignment involved helping to organize newly arrived batches of papyrus, checking them for damage and sorting them according to the preliminary cataloging notes. This meant carefully unrolling fragile sheets, my fingers tracing the thin, brittle fibers, and feeling the subtle variations in their texture. Some were rough and coarse, others surprisingly smooth, hinting at different origins and quality of material. As I worked, I recalled the lessons from my early tutors on the careful handling of ancient texts, a skill that felt more critical now than ever. The sheer volume of these new acquisitions, brought from across the known world, was staggering. During this time, I noticed a particular type of discoloration affecting some of the older scrolls. It wasn't the uniform browning of age, but rather patchy, almost crystalline formations that seemed to eat into the papyrus. When I inquired about it, a senior scribe, a man whose hands were stained perpetually with ink, explained it was a form of mold, difficult to combat once it took hold, especially in scrolls that had endured long sea voyages. This sparked a conversation about the various methods employed to combat pests and decay, from scented cedarwood blocks placed strategically among the shelves to carefully controlled ventilation. This practical engagement also revealed the extensive methods used for scroll restoration. I saw scribes expertly patching tears with finely prepared strips of new papyrus, their work almost invisible against the original material. They used a light adhesive made from a mixture of flour and water, carefully applied with slender brushes. It was a delicate surgery, requiring immense patience and a deep understanding of how the papyrus would react. My own early attempts at mending a torn fragment of an unimportant text under the watchful eye of a master restorer were clumsy by comparison, but I felt a growing respect for this meticulous craft. Furthermore, I learned about the complex system of cataloging and indexing employed within the scriptorium. Each scroll, upon arrival and after any necessary repairs, was assigned a unique identifier and its contents summarized in detailed registers. This process was crucial for scholars seeking specific texts, and the precision required was immense. I assisted in transcribing these summaries, a task that demanded not only accuracy in recording the subject matter, but also a keen eye for identifying potential forgeries or misattributed works, which the library actively sought to weed out. It was during one such cataloging session that I encountered a scroll described as a treatise on celestial observations, attributed to a Hellenistic astronomer whose works were famously debated for their authenticity. The existing scholarly consensus was divided. Some believed the attributed author had indeed penned it, while others argued it was a later compilation presented under a famous name to lend it authority. The sheer volume of complex calculations and observations within this particular scroll presented a fascinating puzzle, a challenge I felt compelled to investigate further, given my own burgeoning interest in the intersection of ancient texts and scientific inquiry. The variety of inks used also proved to be a subject of much interest. While black ink, typically made from lamp black or charcoal mixed with a binder, was common, I saw scribes occasionally using vibrant red inks for headings, important annotations, or decorative elements. These red inks were often made from ochre or vermilion, ground minerals that provided their vivid hue. The subtle differences in their application, the thickness of the line, and the way the ink lay upon the papyrus told a story of different scribes, different materials, and perhaps even different regions of origin for the texts themselves. I also became privy to the subtle art of identifying fraudulent texts, a practice that was as old as scholarship itself. The senior scribe pointed out the telltale signs, inconsistencies in the writing style compared to known works of an author, the use of papyrus that was too new or too old for the purported era, or even the accidental inclusion of anachronistic references. He recounted a story with a chuckle about a remarkably convincing imitation of a rare philosophical dialogue that had almost slipped through, only to be betrayed by a single misplaced comma in a dialectical structure that was not yet in common use at the time of the attributed author. This practical work in the scriptorium offered a stark contrast to the more theoretical challenges I had faced thus far. It wasn't about the intellectual thrill of decipherment or the subtle dance of academic politics that I had already encountered. It was about the tangible, physical act of preserving knowledge, about ensuring that these fragile remnants of the past could endure for future generations. The constant, low hum of activity, punctuated by the rustle of papyrus and the soft scratching of pens, created a unique working environment, one that was both grounding and inspiring in its dedication to a shared purpose. During this period, I also witnessed the library's extensive network for acquiring new texts. Merchants and emissaries arrived regularly, bringing with them bundles of scrolls purchased from distant lands or newly discovered in forgotten tombs. Each arrival was met with careful inspection and cataloging, a vital process for the continuous growth of the library's collection. It was clear that the library was not merely a repository, but a living entity, constantly being fed and expanded by the flow of information from across the Hellenistic world and beyond. One particular merchant, a jovial man who dealt in rare spices and ancient maps, brought in a collection of fragmented administrative records from a newly conquered Phoenician city. Among them was a papyrus detailing grain distribution quotas, written in a script I dimly recognized as a variation of Aramaic. While seemingly mundane, the merchant mentioned that these particular records had been salvaged from a temple archive that had been partially burned during the city's final days. The thought of historical records being deliberately destroyed or lost to fire added a layer of urgency to our work, a sense of combating oblivion itself. The scholarly debate I encountered concerning the Treatise on Celestial Observations resurfaced as I worked with other astronomical texts in the scriptorium. I found cross-references in other scrolls that seemed to support both sides of the argument regarding its authorship. One later treatise, for instance, cited specific astronomical data that, if accurate, could only have been gathered by the original author. However, another fragment discussed the very same celestial phenomena, but with a slightly different observational methodology that suggested a later refinement. This ongoing scholarly disagreement concerning the precise dating and attribution of significant scientific works highlighted the constant nature of historical inquiry and the careful, evidence-based approach required to resolve such questions. The challenge of correctly dating and authenticating the Treatise on Celestial Observations had tested me in ways I was only beginning to grasp. While examining a recent shipment of scrolls that arrived from the lands recently brought under Ptolemaic rule, my work took an unexpected turn. These documents, detailing administrative matters and local customs from a conquered territory, initially seemed straightforward, another task in the careful cataloging process. However, as I unfurled each brittle papyrus, a pattern of deliberate alteration began to emerge, subtle at first, then undeniably clear. Someone had gone through these records and carefully rewritten them, smoothing over accounts that might reflect unfavorably on the new rulers or highlight dissent. This discovery was deeply unsettling, far more so than the scholarly rivalries I had already encountered. I found annotations and cross-references that pointed not to genuine errors or omissions, but to intentional omissions and fabrications. Entire passages that described local grievances or the complexities of pre-conquest governance had been carefully excised, replaced by sanitized versions that painted a picture of willing submission and immediate prosperity. The very act of rewriting history felt like a violation of the sacred trust placed in this institution, a betrayal of the pursuit of truth. A profound internal conflict began to stir within me then, a wrestling match between my ingrained duty as a scholar and the emerging reality of the library's complexities. My training had instilled in me a fervent belief in the importance of preserving and disseminating knowledge, of making the past accessible and understandable. Yet, the evidence before me suggested that certain factions within the library, or perhaps those who commissioned these texts, had a different agenda altogether: the need for secrecy and a carefully managed political narrative. I found myself pausing, my hand hovering over a particularly doctored passage, my mind racing with the implications. Were these alterations sanctioned by the highest levels, a necessary tool for maintaining stability in a vast, diverse empire? Or were they the work of ambitious individuals seeking to curry favor, shaping the historical record to their own ends? The sheer volume of this carefully curated falsity indicated a systematic effort, a disturbing whisper of suppression that echoed through the quiet halls of learning. The papyrus felt unusually rough beneath my fingertips as I traced a line of altered text, the sensation a stark contrast to the smooth, well-worn scrolls I had grown accustomed to. This wasn't merely a matter of academic disagreement or differing interpretations. This was a deliberate manipulation of facts, an attempt to erase inconvenient truths and present a more palatable, though ultimately false, version of events. The knowledge I was meant to safeguard was being actively corrupted, and my role as a curator felt suddenly fraught with a new kind of responsibility. The scent of aged papyrus and dry ink, usually comforting, now seemed to carry an undertone of something else, a faint, unpleasant aroma of deceit. I recalled conversations with the keeper of secrets, his hushed warnings about the sensitive nature of some archives and the need for discretion. At the time, I had interpreted his words as pertaining to esoteric or potentially dangerous knowledge, but now I understood they might also encompass information that simply challenged established power structures or political agendas. This realization presented a stark choice, a crossroads that felt far more significant than any scholarly debate I had faced. My fundamental belief in the library's mission was being tested by the very materials entrusted to its care. The path of least resistance would be to catalog these altered documents as received, to ignore the inconsistencies and fulfill my assigned task without question. This would preserve my standing, my patron's favor, and avoid any potential friction with those who clearly wielded influence. However, remaining silent meant a tacit acceptance of this historical revisionism, a personal compromise of my core values. I knew that if I ignored this evidence, these fabricated accounts would become part of the permanent record, shaping future understanding and perpetuating falsehoods. The potential to recover the original, unaltered truth, to restore the integrity of the historical accounts, pulsed within me like a forgotten drumbeat, urging me toward a different course of action. The weight of this decision pressed upon me, a heavy cloak of responsibility. I considered the other scholars I had encountered, the meticulousness of their work, the passion for uncovering genuine knowledge that drove them. Would they stand by and allow such a deliberate perversion of history to occur without challenge? My own intellectual curiosity, honed through years of study and now sharpened by this discovery, demanded that I seek out the original narratives, to understand what had been so carefully hidden. This quest for truth felt like an inherent part of my being, a driving force that propelled me forward. The choice before me was clear, though fraught with peril. My personal ambition to prove my worth had been overshadowed by a deeper imperative, to safeguard the authenticity of the past. The thought of simply re-archiving these doctored scrolls, allowing the deception to go unchallenged, gnawed at my conscience. I knew then that my journey here was about more than just cataloging. It was about actively protecting the integrity of the knowledge housed within these walls, even at personal risk. This encounter with the deliberate alteration of historical records lingered in my thoughts, a stark reminder of the complex realities that lay beneath the surface of scholarly pursuit. The task of carefully re-archiving the administrative scrolls from the recently annexed territories felt like a betrayal of the very principles that had drawn me to Alexandria. Each rustle of papyrus seemed to echo with the silence of silenced voices, the whispers of history deliberately scrubbed clean. My duty was clear. Follow the directives from the senior administration, simply mark the altered documents, and place them back into their designated sections. Yet, the sight of the original notations, stark and defiant against the imposed narrative, stirred a deep unrest within me. This internal struggle intensified as I worked. I found myself lingering over certain passages, comparing the original script with the overlaid corrections. It wasn't just about differing accounts of trade routes or tax collections. It was about the deliberate omission of peoples, of events, of entire perspectives that didn't fit the conquering power's story. A wry thought crossed my mind. If the ink could speak, it would likely scream in protest at this intellectual vandalism. I felt a growing responsibility to these silenced words, a responsibility that pressed down heavier than any papyrus scroll. I considered the consequences of my thoughts, the potential danger of even harboring them. My patron, whose considerable generosity had made this entire journey possible, had invested much in my success. To be found questioning the established order, especially concerning matters of state, could jeopardize not only my current position, but also any hope of future advancement. The thought of failing him, of returning to Greece with empty hands and a tarnished reputation, was a powerful deterrent, a chill that prickled my skin despite the warmth of the study. However, the sheer act of discovery had ignited something within me, a scholar's instinct that demanded more than mere compliance. I remembered the lessons on textual criticism, on the vital importance of provenance, and the meticulous tracing of a document's history. To simply re-archive these altered texts without acknowledgement felt like a disservice to the very art of scholarship I had come here to practice and perfect. It was a conflict between obedience and integrity, a dilemma that tightened in my chest with every passing moment. The debate surrounding the authenticity of historical astronomical treatises, a topic that had consumed many of the senior scholars, suddenly seemed less pressing than this immediate, tangible act of historical erasure. My work with the scriptorium, where I had learned about the various methods of papyrus treatment and ink composition, now offered a practical path forward. I understood how easily alterations could be made, how subtle the manipulation could be, and how difficult it would be to prove without concrete evidence. One particular scroll, a local administrative record detailing a festival observance, had a passage describing a significant community gathering that was entirely missing from its corrected counterpart. The original text spoke of communal feasting and shared rituals that celebrated a local deity, a detail that the amended version omitted entirely, replacing it with a dry account of a grain tax collection. This felt like a deliberate severing of cultural connection, a severing that needed to be countered. My mind raced through the possible courses of action, each with its own set of risks and rewards. I could follow protocol, my conscience the only witness to my quiet unease. Or I could attempt to preserve the original, unaltered fragments, perhaps by discreetly making my own copies or by marking them in a way that only a fellow scholar, a future seeker of truth, might understand. The latter path promised a greater sense of purpose, but it also carried the heavier burden of potential discovery and retribution. I decided to pursue a middle ground, a path that acknowledged the rules while still honoring the truth as I understood it. Using the fine, almost invisible ink employed for making marginalia, I began to make very subtle marks on the original fragments themselves, marks that indicated the presence of a preceding, altered text without overtly stating it. It was a risk, a deviation from the prescribed procedure, but one that felt essential to my burgeoning understanding of my role within this vast repository of knowledge. Following this quiet act of defiance, I also decided to create a personal index, a private ledger detailing the specific scrolls I had found altered, noting the nature of the changes and the locations where the original fragments were now housed. This required meticulous cross-referencing and careful documentation, a task that demanded all my attention and diligence. The information I was gathering felt immensely valuable, even if its existence remained a carefully guarded secret. As I meticulously recorded these details, a new appreciation for the library's vastness and the immense effort involved in its organization settled upon me. I saw how easily such alterations could be lost in the sheer volume of material, how important it was for individual scholars to remain vigilant. A peculiar, almost humorous thought surfaced. If I were ever to write a treatise on the art of subtle rebellion within archival systems, this would be my primary case study. The weight of this decision, however, was not lost on me. I knew that by choosing to preserve these fragments, even discreetly, I was stepping onto a precarious ledge. My reputation, my patrons' trust, and my very presence within the hallowed halls of the Mausean were all now subject to the unseen currents of politics and power that flowed beneath the surface of scholarly pursuits. The quiet hum of intellectual activity now seemed to carry a more complex, more shadowed undertone. I had witnessed something that would stay with me, a stark reminder of the fragility of history and the often invisible battles fought to preserve its integrity. My journey was not merely about cataloging and understanding. It was also about safeguarding the very essence of truth itself, a truth that sometimes needed a hidden mark, a whispered clue to survive. My current task involved examining a collection of philosophical writings, a collection that had recently arrived from a region known for its long intellectual traditions. To prove my worthiness for a permanent role here, I needed to meticulously verify the authenticity of each text, a process demanding a keen eye for detail and a deep understanding of how ideas evolve and are attributed. My training in identifying pseudepigrapha, or writings falsely attributed to respected authors, would be tested as I traced the provenance, the history of ownership and origin of every papyrus roll. The pressure to perform flawlessly weighed heavily, as a single misstep in this area could seriously harm my scholarly reputation and thus my chances of remaining in this esteemed institution. The first few scrolls presented a familiar challenge, featuring arguments I had encountered in earlier studies, though these versions seemed to possess a certain unique phrasing. I carefully laid them out, comparing the script, the ink composition, and the very style of argumentation, all while trying to recall specific passages from similar works housed elsewhere in the Great Library. This comparative analysis was not merely about recognizing an author's hand. It was about understanding the currents of thought that flowed through the ancient world, how one philosopher might build upon another or subtly diverge over generations. The sheer volume of such interconnected knowledge here was overwhelming, yet also incredibly exhilarating. As I delved deeper, a particular set of treatises attributed to a philosopher whose early works were foundational to our understanding of civic virtue presented a significant puzzle. These particular scrolls had markings indicating they had passed through several hands before reaching Alexandria, each owner adding their own notes or corrections. One of these editions, a lengthy commentary on the nature of justice, felt strangely out of place with the original author's known philosophical leanings. I felt a growing unease, a whisper of doubt about the true origin of this particular section, and knew I must investigate further. This specific commentary's philosophical arguments, while eloquently presented, seemed to subtly shift the emphasis from the individual's duty to the state towards a more passive acceptance of authority. This was a deviation from the philosopher's established principles, a point I had meticulously studied in my earlier academic life back in Greece. I began to cross-reference this commentary with other known texts from the same period, searching for any shared linguistic patterns or conceptual frameworks that might either confirm its authenticity or suggest a different origin, perhaps a later admirer or even a deliberate imitator seeking to lend weight to their own ideas. The scent of aged papyrus, a constant companion in these halls, seemed to grow stronger as I concentrated, a dry, slightly sweet aroma that mingled with the faint earthy undertones from the nearby storage vaults. I meticulously documented every annotation, every ink variation, and every subtle difference in the papyrus's texture. My fingers, accustomed to the smooth glide of well-preserved papyrus, found a slightly rougher surface on these disputed sections, a tactile difference that, while minor, added to my growing suspicion. This careful physical examination was as important as the intellectual comparison. Then I discovered a small, almost imperceptible inscription on the verso, the backside of one of the scrolls, tucked away in a margin that had been carefully smoothed over. It was a symbol, a personal mark that I recognized from my research on the scribal guilds of the Egyptian city of Memphis, a mark associated with a particular school of thought known for its adherence to a more centralized form of governance. This discovery was electrifying, a tangible clue pointing away from the philosopher I was originally meant to verify and towards a different yet significant lineage of thought. My initial ambition to simply catalog these scrolls now transformed into a deeper quest to understand their true intellectual heritage. The carefully guarded knowledge of provenance was not just an academic exercise. It was about preserving the purity of philosophical lineage and understanding how ideas themselves traveled and transformed. A misattribution could, over time, lead entire schools of thought astray, subtly altering the foundation upon which future thinkers built. The responsibility felt immense, a burden I willingly embraced for the sake of clear historical understanding. This discovery also brought to mind a conversation I'd had with a fellow scholar, an expert in early Greek poetry, just days before. He too had encountered a series of seemingly authentic poems that, upon closer inspection of their watermarks and ink composition, proved to be skillful imitations, crafted perhaps to celebrate a popular poet or even to subtly influence public opinion through verse. We had lamented then how difficult it was to separate genuine artistry from clever mimicry, a challenge that echoed deeply within the philosophical treatises before me. The possibility of forgeries, or at least misattributions, within such esteemed philosophical works raised a critical question. How much of what we accept as foundational truth might have been shaped by individuals with their own agendas, subtly influencing the course of intellectual history? It was a thought that stirred a quiet unease, a contemplation of the unseen forces that shape our understanding of the past. This pursuit of definitive proof of origin was not just about fulfilling my assignment, it was about discerning the genuine voice from the echo. My work on authenticating these philosophical treatises had led me to this unexpected moment of scholarly detective work, uncovering a potential divergence in the recorded history of an influential thinker. Working on the authentication task, I found myself collaborating with another ambitious young scholar, an ally rather than a rival, who specialized in a different area of ancient languages. His name was Alexander, and his focus was on the intricate grammar of Sogdian traders' accounts, a field as vital to understanding the reach of our civilization as any Greek philosopher's treatise. We met by chance in a dimly lit alcove where papyrus fragments were being pieced together, and a shared frustration over a difficult passage led to a hesitant exchange of ideas. I had been struggling with the provenance, or origin and history of ownership, of several seemingly minor religious hymns, and Lysander's insight into how trade routes influenced the migration of religious texts proved invaluable, showing me that the path of a scroll often mirrored that of its owner. Building on our initial conversation, Lysander and I began to meet regularly, sharing our findings and offering mutual assistance in overcoming complex linguistic hurdles and potential forgeries. He possessed a keen eye for identifying anachronisms, those elements that simply did not belong in a given historical period, whether it was a subtly misplaced idiom in a supposed Homeric fragment or an unusual alloy in a bronze stylus. My own expertise lay in comparative philology, the study of related languages and how their structures evolved, and together we formed a formidable team. This collaboration provided a much-needed counterbalance to the often solitary and sometimes tense atmosphere within the library, offering not just scholarly support, but a sense of shared purpose against the vastness of the task. Our working sessions often took place amidst the more secluded sections of the Great Hall of Scrolls, away from the more public reading rooms where hushed tones were expected. Here, the faint, dry aroma of aged papyrus was more pronounced, mingling with the clean scent of beeswax used for sealing wax. The marble floors remained cool beneath our sandals, a constant reminder of the immense structure we inhabited. Lysander and I would spread our fragments and reference scrolls across a sturdy wooden table, the flickering light from oil lamps casting long shadows that seemed to dance with the whispers of forgotten ages, all while we carefully debated the merits of a particular interpretation. One particular challenge involved authenticating a collection of what were claimed to be early Pythagorean treatises, philosophical writings attributed to the ancient Greek mathematician and philosopher Pythagoras. The sheer volume of such attributions, known as pseudepigrapha, or writings falsely attributed to an author, was staggering, and distinguishing the genuine from the fabricated required meticulous cross-referencing. Lysander's knowledge of ancient Near Eastern trade languages proved surprisingly relevant here, as he pointed out a recurring phrase in what was purported to be an early Pythagorean text that mirrored a specific Accabian administrative formula used centuries later, a clear indicator of later interpolation. This discovery brought a quickened pulse to our work, a sense that we were not merely cataloging history, but actively defending its integrity from those who would distort it for their own ends. We had to carefully document these discrepancies, noting the specific linguistic evidence that cast doubt on the authenticity of these particular texts. The stakes felt high, Misattributing a significant philosophical work could mislead entire schools of thought for generations, a thought that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a heavy responsibility, and knowing Lysander shared this concern made the burden feel lighter, like carrying a great weight together rather than alone. Lysander also shared his own growing suspicions about the hidden agendas within the institution, a sentiment I had begun to harbor myself. He spoke of how certain newly acquired scrolls, especially those from recently conquered territories, seemed to disappear from the public cataloging lists with surprising regularity. He recounted a conversation he'd overheard between two senior librarians discussing the delicate nature of administrative documents from a Western province, suggesting a desire to manage or perhaps even suppress certain historical narratives deemed inconvenient. This shared unease fostered a deeper bond between us, a quiet understanding that our work extended beyond deciphering texts to something more profound. We learned about the practicalities of papyrus conservation from an experienced scribe named Pothos, a man whose hands, stained perpetually with ink and pigments, moved with the grace of a dancer. He showed us how to gently unroll brittle papyrus, how to treat mold with precise applications of vinegar, and the different types of inks used, from the simple carbon black made from soot to the richer, more expensive iron gall ink that could fade if not prepared correctly. Pothos also spoke with a knowing sigh about the prevalence of forgeries in the trade of ancient texts, noting how even the most convincing forgeries often betrayed themselves through subtle errors in script or inconsistencies in the material itself. This period also involved a significant, albeit rather obscure, scholarly debate that had been quietly simmering among a few specialists: the precise dating of a series of astronomical observations recorded on ostraca, small pieces of pottery used for writing. Most scholars placed them in the Hellenistic period, but a recent analysis of the lunar calculations suggested a possibility that they might actually originate from an earlier Babylonian tradition, adapted and reused by Greek astronomers. Lysander, with his knack for cross-cultural linguistic influence, argued that certain peculiar phrasing in the accompanying notes strongly supported the earlier Babylonian origin, a point I found myself agreeing with wholeheartedly as I examined the textual evidence. Amidst our shared research and growing camaraderie, Lysander once made a light-hearted quip about the sheer volume of scrolls we still had to process, remarking that it would take 1,000 lifetimes to even skim the surface of all the knowledge stored here. I chuckled, thinking of the endless rows of shelves and the sheer audacity of our ambition to contribute meaningfully to such a repository. Another moment of levity came when we discovered a scribe's forgotten doodle of a comical-looking bird on the back of a fragment detailing tax levies, a small human touch that reminded us that even the most serious scholars had their moments of playfulness. The ongoing challenge of authentication required us to trace the provenance of each scroll meticulously, examining colophons, those concluding notes, often containing information about the scribe and date of completion, and comparing them with known records. We learned to look for inconsistencies in the dialect or vocabulary used, which could indicate a later scribe attempting to update or improve an older text. It was a painstaking process, like piecing together a shattered mirror, and a single misplaced fragment or misidentified inscription could send us back to the beginning, a prospect that always brought a slight tightening in my chest. The complexity of library politics, which I had only begun to sense before meeting Lysander, became much clearer through our shared observations. We noticed how certain scholars seemed to gain privileged access to newly arrived collections, while others, myself included initially, had to work through layers of approval for even the most routine tasks. Lysander confided that his own work on Sogdian texts had been met with a degree of indifference by some, as if the commercial writings of distant traders were less important than the philosophical musings of Greek thinkers, a subtle hierarchy that he found both baffling and disheartening. This period of intense collaboration and shared discovery solidified a crucial understanding for me, that true scholarship was not a solitary pursuit, but a communal endeavor built on trust and mutual respect. Lysander's perspective, honed by his unique linguistic focus, opened my eyes to connections I would have otherwise missed, and I believe my own analytical methods offered him a new way to approach his authentication problems. Our alliance, forged in the dust of ancient papyrus and fueled by a shared dedication to historical accuracy, felt like a vital anchor in the often turbulent waters of the library. It was during this time, while discussing the potential suppression of administrative records from the Western province, that Lysander mentioned a peculiar detail he'd come across: a series of coded notations within certain otherwise mundane trade agreements. These weren't the familiar shorthand marks of scribes, but a more complex, hidden language, hinting at information being passed covertly between individuals, possibly even within the library itself. The implications were profound, suggesting that the pursuit of knowledge was entangled with currents of power and secrecy that ran far deeper than I had imagined. The sheer scope of the knowledge I'd gained felt both weighty and precious. The grandeur of the Mausean, while intellectually stimulating, was but one facet of this magnificent city. Alexandria itself pulsed with a life so different from the quiet halls of learning, yet so intrinsically linked. I began to venture beyond the scholarly enclave, my curiosity drawing me into the labyrinthine streets where the very pulse of Egypt could be felt. It was in these bustling thoroughfares that the scrolls I studied began to breathe, their ancient ink whispering tales of the very world I was now walking through. My first destination was the Great Market, a place where 1,000 voices mingled in a vibrant tapestry of commerce. Merchants from across the known world displayed their wares, and the air carried a medley of scents: the sharp bite of imported spices, the sweet perfume of blooming jasmine carried on the breeze, and the earthy aroma of fresh clay goods baked under the intense Egyptian sun. I saw vendors hawking bolts of fine linen, the same kind described in papyri detailing trade routes, and others offered baskets overflowing with dates, their skins glistening with natural sweetness, a staple food I had only encountered in written accounts. It was here that I encountered the practical application of the texts that filled my days. A spice merchant, his hands stained a deep ochre from handling turmeric, meticulously weighed out fragrant cardamom pods. The very names of these spices, which I had painstakingly catalogued from inventories found within the library, now had faces and voices associated with them. This sensory immersion provided a tangible connection to the abstract knowledge I possessed, grounding the ancient words in the vibrant reality of the present. Further exploration led me towards the harbor, a constant hum of activity against the vast expanse of the Mediterranean Sea. The cries of gulls overhead, sharp and insistent, mingled with the rhythmic creak of wooden hulls and the shouted commands of sailors. Ships, their sails furled like sleeping giants, were being loaded and unloaded with goods from distant shores. Amphorae filled with olive oil from Crete, sacks of grain from Egypt's fertile delta, and carved ivory from lands far to the south. The constant motion and the sheer scale of the port underscored the reach of Alexandria's influence, a concept I had previously grasped only through maps and trade manifests. These ships were not merely vessels of commerce. They were arteries carrying knowledge, ideas, and people, mirroring the very function of the great library itself. The salty tang of the sea, sharp and invigorating, was a welcome contrast to the dry, aged scent of papyrus, hinting at the immense world from which our collection had been assembled. Wandering through a less crowded district near the harbor, I came across a craftsman meticulously repairing a fishing net. The rough texture of the hemp cord against his calloused fingers, the focused intensity in his eyes as he knotted the strands, spoke of a skill passed down through generations. He paused his work to share a small sun-dried fig, its intensely sweet flavor bursting on my tongue. This simple act of sharing, a gesture of human connection amidst the ceaseless activity, felt as significant as any scholarly debate. This encounter also reminded me that the knowledge within the library was not merely of kings and scholars, but of the everyday lives of the people who built and sustained this civilization. The efficiency of their methods, the practicality of their tools, these aspects, often overlooked in grand historical narratives, were crucial to understanding the broader context of the texts I worked with. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the midday warmth, I found myself in a smaller, quieter square where an elderly storyteller held a small crowd captivated. He spoke of ancient heroes and forgotten gods, his voice rising and falling with dramatic flair. The stories he told, though delivered orally, contained echoes of legends I had seen referenced in fragmented poetic scrolls, their origins debated and their exact wording lost to time. Listening to him, I realized that the oral tradition and the written word were not entirely separate, but rather two sides of the same coin, both preserving the memory and spirit of the past. His performance, so alive and immediate, offered a different perspective on how history and culture were transmitted, a more fluid and adaptable form than the fixed nature of a papyrus scroll. This experience prompted a contemplation on the nature of preservation itself. While the library aimed to safeguard texts against the ravages of time, were there not other forms of knowledge equally vital that existed beyond the written word? The skills of the craftsman, the narratives of the storyteller, the traditions of the market vendor. These were all forms of cultural inheritance, unique in their own right and facing their own challenges in a changing world. My time spent observing the vibrant life of Alexandria, from its bustling markets to its storied port, began to change how I understood the very purpose of my work. The scrolls were not merely abstract collections of data. They were living testaments to the lives, beliefs, and aspirations of the people who created them, and whose descendants still walked these very streets. This exploration had undoubtedly broadened my understanding of the vast scope of human endeavor and the enduring power of shared experience. As the last rays of the Mediterranean sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of soft lavender and rose, let the quiet wisdom of the great library of Alexandria settle upon you. Imagine the scrolls, meticulously catalogued and studied by scholars from across the Hellenistic world, their diligent minds piecing together the knowledge of ages. Think of Eratosthenes, his keen calculations charting the very curve of our Earth, or Aristarchus, daring to propose that our sun, not our world, was the center of it all. These were minds driven by an insatiable curiosity, a quiet dedication to understanding the universe. Let their pursuit of knowledge now inspire your own journey into peaceful slumber. As you drift off, let the gentle rustle of papyrus and the soft murmur of ancient Greek fade into the quiet of the night. Rest now, dear friends, and may your dreams be as the illuminating as the discoveries made within those hallowed halls. Sleep soundly.